Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome in this rainy afternoon in Brussels. Of course, we are connecting from all over the world, so good morning or good evening to those who are from the other time zone. We are starting the panel for the supervision, for the enforcement, for those who try to check if the controllers, if the processors on the market and in the public administration are compliant with the requirements that are set out in the law, but also compliant with the privacy itself and data protection itself, as they are understood all over the world in different cultures. And we have the panel which will be talking about supervision and compliance of ICT, cloud, and communication providers. And four puzzles of this picture of successful compliance. Effective DPA supervision, awareness and cooperation of public authorities, importance and high expertise, and finally, consumer perspective. And also four corners of the world and four speakers who will be presenting their point of views. We have here a part from the representatives of EDPS, European Data Protection Supervisor, which is my office. We have here Andres Barreto, who is the Commissioner for Colombian Data Protection Authority and who will give us an overview of possible supervisory approaches vis-à-vis public authorities in the field of ICT providers, including cloud services and including communication providers. And then we will have Amanda Edmonds, Director from the Office of Privacy Commissioner of Canada. She will reflect, based on experience, on how their office has approached dealing with the data-driven technologies and ICT through enforcement actions, including those used or accessed by public authorities. And then we are moving to completely different approach, which is the approach of Paul van den Berg from the Dutch Ministry of Justice and Security, who will share with us the essential elements of controller process or contracts to ensure the controller is actually in control, and some spicy information about how to deal with those who are the big players in the market. Also some spicy information from Marian Fernandez Perez, Senior Digital Policy Officer of BEUC, who will tell us about the consumer protection point of view and perspective, but also will tell us about the something which is in the news today, something which is commented all over the world, which is the enforcement action that she was taking part in. So, four pieces of puzzles, four approaches, and well, let's go. Let's start with the presentation from Colombia. Anders, nice to hear you here. Nice to see you here.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you from Colombia. Good afternoon to you. Thank you for your invitation. I would like to start addressing what the Colombian authority has been doing in this matter. And we do think that first we have to have an approach where we have to keep in mind that data protection as a regulation is thematically and technologically neutral. And this imposes several challenges for authorities in order not to asphyxiate development or artificial intelligence or other new tools, but we do have to keep in mind the consumer protection and, of course, the protection of a fundamental right, as it is in Colombia, as privacy and data protection. So this neutrality means that it applies to any data processing, regardless of the techniques or processes or the engineering that it develops and the technologies that they use. Therefore, they have to fulfill by whoever performs data processing, including those related to intelligence, artificial intelligence, which we have launched recently a guideline in order to try to guide the industry in this aspect, robotics as well, and cloud services. These technological developments can be an excuse to disregard data protection regulations, so we have to keep in mind the balance between development and the balance between the protection of these fundamental rights. However, the discussion in Colombia is now a hot topic because of the recent developments of our authority, but we have to keep in mind that our regulation is not that far away from the European perspective. We do find few challenges of what the US view is about or is all about data protection due to the fact that, as you know, the US doesn't have a federal law that regulates the matter, and of course, it's our first or more important commercial ally. Data protection authorities should use tools as ex officio investigations in order to verify, as a precautionary measure, if ICT service providers are complying with data protection regulations. As an example, Colombia has undertaken several ex officio investigations against businesses like Facebook, Google, TikTok, WhatsApp, Uber, and Zoom, not only to verify their privacy policy, but to verify how they comply not only with the Colombian regulation, but with the international regulation. We have been very successful in trying to also use the investigations that other authorities, including the US authorities, have carried on these platforms. So we think DPA should be more coordinating among enforcement actions and in order to evaluate the level of accomplishment related to data protection regulations. Therefore, for us, it is crucial that data protection authorities work permanently as a team and not in an isolated or sporadic manner. This is a huge challenge here because, as I stated, for instance, we try to coordinate many of our investigations with the US and we have been very successful with the FTC. However, we have the challenge of the different perspective on the regulations and the fact that Colombia has a more European perspective of the data protection as many of the Latin American countries. So we think that privacy and ethics and safety and, of course, accountability and compliance should be a key joint effort in order to comply with the proper regulation without asphyxiating the businesses. Since early stages, we have seen that ICT service providers have tried to approach the authorities in order to comply with regulation. However, we think that, of course, regulation is not the only tool or not the only mean that we can provide businesses. That is why we are very active in producing guidelines, producing more educational tools in order for them to comply with regulations in Colombia and worldwide. For now, it's very interesting because Colombia is now holding the presidency of the Ibero-American Network of Data Protection Authorities, and for us, it's a huge challenge, not only to learn from our partners, but to try to influence in a positive way in where regulation and the landscape and the shaping of this discussion is all around the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Well, let's move then to the other point of view, which is also presented by the Data Protection Authority itself. Now we move to Canada and we move to Privacy Commissioner of Canada. And Amanda, could you please tell us what are the practical experiences and the approach to the compliance from the Canadian Federal Authority? Oh, once again, we don't hear you. Okay, now it's better.
Apologies for that. As Andreas was reflecting, that the new technology has made our digital world interconnected. And so there's all of those international dimensions that we need to consider. And also it has led, I think, to increased integration in some ways between private sector and public sectors, certainly in terms of data. There's a couple of key investigations that our office has published in the last couple of years that I wanted to touch on today. The first one is an investigation we did in the public sector. So our office regulates both the federal public sector and the private sector in Canada. And this one was around Statistics Canada. So Statistics Canada undertook an exercise to collect the credit records of most Canadians from one of our two major credit reporting bureaus in Canada. And they were also exploring a project to collect transaction records from all of the major banks in Canada. So this, I think, just really illustrates the depth of the potential integration and how all of that data and all of those huge data repositories have unexpected new linkages. In this particular case, we focused on whether Statistics Canada had done enough to determine whether the privacy implications outweighed the benefits from the material they could do. And really what we focused on is that when looking at collecting these vast amounts of data, that they really need to take those perspectives into consideration, particularly when, well, not only particularly, but when collecting from the private sector, as was the case in this instance, from a major service provider in the private sector. We found that while the law, our particular law in this context, which is fairly old, was not contravened, that there were important things that Statistics Canada needed to do before it would undertake these kind of large data collections from the private sector. Then more specifically related to ICT and cloud service, we also looked at Microsoft Windows 10, which, as you know, included a much greater integration with the cloud. And of course, this affects lots of individuals and businesses and public sector entities who use Windows 10. Now, I think we all take as a premise that any organization, be it public or private sector, needs to maintain a level of control over the personal information, the personal data that it is responsible for. But the challenge really comes when using these new technologies, including the cloud, including ICT providers in ever-evolving ways. How do you make sure that you're doing that in a meaningful way? And what role do private sector providers have in making sure that organizations and individuals are empowered to retain the kind of control that we expect? Now, I imagine that most in the audience are familiar with the concept of click wrap, which is where you use a software that you need to keep up with where your stakeholders are, to keep up with the world, to cut costs, to improve security, and you're faced with a single option that says, click here, accept all of the terms and conditions. And I think that that's one of the biggest challenges that there is to making sure that institutions and organizations are keeping meaningful control. Now, Windows 10 installation process was not a single click button. However, we looked at it closely and we felt that there was still a lot of ways in which it didn't give enough control to users so that they could make choices, well-informed choices, to retain meaningful control of the personal information, either the personal information of individuals or personal information they'd be responsible for. We started by looking at an initial process they had, which had a get going fast page, and it expressed settings. And what we found is while there was an option to customize, it was not prominent at all. And that led people away from that important option to the express settings. We also found that in the express settings, there was learn more options, but in the customizing, there was no links to further information for people to really understand what it was they were choosing, which is clearly important if someone has indicated that they need to make some choices. We also looked at the way the default settings generally were set to on or full by default, and you could opt out of certain practices, but by default, a lot of information was being sent to Microsoft. And this was not just information relating to, say, security practices and making sure that your system was up to date. For instance, there was speech recognition because of the new assistant, and that speech information was being uploaded to the cloud. So there was processing of voice data, which obviously can be quite sensitive and reveal a lot of information. Ultimately, Microsoft committed to implement all of the recommendations that we made for them to address our concerns, and they were very cooperative in the investigation. Most notably, they implemented a solution where users were presented with no pre-selected privacy options. So they changed the design of the installation process so that instead of having an option pre-selected, let's say, to default to send full diagnostic information to Microsoft, instead there would be, the choices would be there. None of them would be pre-selected, but users or installers would not be able to move to the next screen until they had selected one of those options. So it really brings control back. And also those options were then supported by detailed information about what the implications would be for users on their functionality and what kind of information might then be transferred to Microsoft and how it would be used. One of the things that I really wanted to focus on here too is that, as Andreas has mentioned, is that the cloud brings us all together in the world. And it's with ICT and cloud services, often your data may well be located in another country and may well be subject to regulations apart from your own. So in this case, we benefited a lot from collaboration with our Dutch colleagues, not only in terms of improving our investigation during the course of it, but we were also able to leverage this collaboration to negotiate with Microsoft to implement privacy setting solutions similar to that implemented in Europe. to again make a coherent set of understanding about what the responsibilities are for an ICT or cloud provider to enable meaningful controls by a public sector user or a private sector user or an individual. So I think it's just to say that there are solutions that can empower users to retain control while recognizing that there is data that needs to flow to maintain security, but that there are some data that flows that is, for instance, some of the data that was being sent to Microsoft was to improve our services to you. So effectively, forms of targeted advertising. So we felt it was important as well to make sure that clicking on options in an installation process does not equate to consent for a range of practices that may have nothing to do with what the user is trying to get out of their cloud or their ICT service provider. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we had two presentations that were directly from those who are in data protection authorities and who are presenting data protection authorities' point of view. Now we should actually move to the presentations which are done by the other institutions and other organizations that are helping DPAs, helping data protection authorities, but first of all doing their own job and doing their own investigations, doing their own assessment of what's going on in the ICT service, what's going on in the cloud service. And we will start with the person who was already called here. The best non-lawyer in the legal business that I know, which is Paul Vandenberg from the Ministry of Justice and Security in the Netherlands. Paul is an ICT geek, but actually he knows about the contracts for the cloud much more than anybody else around, and also can advise the people who are both ICT, who are the managers, and who are the data protection specialists. And he will tell us how it looks in practice, and what can the supervisory authorities do better, and what can administration do better than it does so far. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wojciech. And first of all, thank you, Amanda, because the story that you told, cooperating with the Dutch authority, actually was a basis for us to continue our work and bring it to, if you will, the real world, where we actually have to implement systems and procure systems and sign contracts with people like Microsoft, Google, Salesforce, etc., and Amazon. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the problems that we're into. So maybe the first slide can be put in there. So there you go. So I made the slide so you all don't have to write it down or get confused, because it's fairly complex. But when contracting hyperscale vendors with hyperscale vendors, the biggest problem is continuously figuring out who is responsible for what, who is the controller and who is the processor. And it will be no surprise to you that the hyperscale vendors such as Microsoft, Google, etc., they would like to be controller. And they like to be controller of all the customer data, because it gives them, if you will, power to process that data for their own purposes, such as the purpose that Amanda mentioned is improving the product or other nefarious reasons. And we'll get to that in a minute a little bit more. The other thing that you find in those contracts is that they will try for you as a client to be responsible to arrange consent for all the users of your system. So what they'll say is, oh, you are a government agency, maybe you're the Social Security Office, and you have lots of civilians coming to your website during Corona, applying for a subsidy or income support, and we would really like you to make sure that you have consent. Well, of course, I don't need to explain to you as lawyers and supervisory authorities that consent, especially in a government context, is a pretty hard and difficult concept, especially if the consent extends further to, oh, you now have consent from your users for us to use the data in any way we see fit, beyond the purpose that you gave it to us in the first place. Well, that's not a consent that anybody should ever give, of course. So that's a problem that you're always discussing with them. The next thing is, what's actually customer data? What is protected by the contract? Very difficult topic to negotiate, but customer data in most of the contracts is data that you typically enter or type yourself into the service or application. So it's like the text of email or a chat message or in a Word document. All other data that's created through using the service is typically considered to be other data. And other data is also known, and it depends on the vendor, and of course the scope and definitions vary per vendor, is also known as diagnostic data, service data, telemetry, log data, and all these other things. And typically, the standard contracts, they will say that that data is collected by the hyperscaler, by the vendor as a controller, and then it will specify that he has the right to process that further for its own legitimate interests, which I always call monetizing or making money off the data. And then they rely on these articles in the GDPR. So this is basically the problem that you face every time you go and negotiate with a hyperscale vendor. So if we switch to the next slide, I'll illustrate the problem a little bit. Can you change the slide, please? Right. So normally I would ask you the question, oh, when you log into a system through such a little screen as this on the internet, where you have to enter your username and password, who do you think owns that data? And what do you think happens with that data? And normally we'd have a discussion. It's a little bit difficult online. But the typical answer is, well, obviously, that's part of logging into our system at the Social Security office or at the government or at the city of Amsterdam or wherever. And the answer is no. If you look at the page before, the contracts will say, well, the fact that the person logs in from a given location at a given time, that he logs into the Social Security office, that he logs into whatever, the vendors consider that to be their data for them to process for their legitimate business purposes, or better, to make a profile of the civilian, such as, oh, Mr. X has logged into the Social Security office many times since January, maybe he has a problem with his employment, or Mrs. X has logged into the website of the hospital at the Department of Neurology, maybe she has some problem in her head, right? And this data is, and we have forensic evidence to prove that, gathered and processed and attached to user profiles, unless you have a better contract which prohibits them to do that. So these are the type of reasons that you have to negotiate a better contract than the standard contract that's offered out of the box. So if you go to the next page of the presentation, also the last page, so these are the points that we tend to fix in contracts, and it is very, very difficult. But of course, you have to clearly define that the customer is the controller. It seems obvious, and the supplier is the processor, except for a very short list of permitted purposes, such as sending invoices and doing other defined things that are very reasonable for them to do, like reporting your revenue as part of the data sets to their financial governance or whatever. We also say consent is a very poor ground to rely for you as a controller. So therefore, we try not to use consent as a ground for any processing, if we can help it at all. And we try to make sure that we are not required by the supplier to manage the consent of the user on their behalf, because obviously you then shift the responsibility, and you're also accepting potentially joint controllership, and you are far more qualified to figure out exactly when joint controllership arises, but we've seen it happen, and we don't want to go there from a procurement and implementation perspective. The other thing is that we write in contracts, they explicitly prohibit any other purpose for processing data, and in particular to create user profiles ID graphs, psychometric data sets, and all that kind of stuff. So we name that, we call it out. Whatever it says, you cannot do these things. You have to make sure that you can fulfill the data subject access rights. So you need to have an admin console that goes right through the supplier's system, and you can draw out the data. And we definitely need far more help there to do that. Retention periods always need to be negotiated, because standard, they will keep them for a year, maybe longer. They'll use it to train AIs and so forth. So you need to limit that retention time to the minimum not necessary for the service and other criteria mentioned in the GDPR. And also the audit rights. That's a big point, and we fought over this long and hard, and we have to do it every time, even though the GDPR provides assistance. Suppliers are reluctant to to comply in this, and you have to make specific audit arrangements, how it works, how much it costs, what you can see, what you can't see, and all these kind of things. And lastly, and not least, you have to make sure suppliers don't upsell on your platform or to your users, and monitor their activities and so forth. And you can imagine there are many more use cases for that. And lastly, what you'll find is that all contracts refer to documents on the internet which can be changed at any time. So often you think you have a contract, but 3 weeks later it will be invalid because the terms have changed. So you need to make sure these terms are fixed and cannot worsen. So these are just a highlight of the typical points that we need to negotiate with large vendors, and at the same time, I'll tell you that we are only partially successful as a government, and we represent about 300,000 users. If we include the municipalities, 500,000, and even then, it costs millions of dollars of euros, and it takes a lot of time and many years to get to a proper contract with Microsoft and Google and those guys. And I really need the supervisory authorities to get together and think about how you can help member states, but also public sector, hospitals, healthcare, educational sectors to fix this, because at this moment they are in grave danger because they cannot negotiate with these people. They don't have the money and the time to spend. So that's kind of the message from the Western Front, as we would say.
Okay, great. I guess that we will have questions about that as well. Thank you, Paul, very much. Well, let's move to the point of view of the consumers, but also the very practical one, also connected with the current cases that are going on and current cases that are BEUC is involved in. And I always think that the conversation with BEUC is a big challenge for the data protection authorities as well.
Thank you very much. So yeah, my name is Marian Fernandez and I work for BEUC, a European consumer organization that represents more than 40 consumer associations across Europe. And today, because, you know, as the last speaker, many things have been said. So I wanted to basically summarize my intervention with 3 main points for a successful compliance recipe. The first one is really a strong and clear legal framework. The second one is effective and swift redress. And the third one is thorough enforcement. And I'm sure that when I say this doesn't sound revolutionary, but as we have just heard, details matter. So the first point, successful compliance starts by having a robust legal framework. A framework that has strong and clear rules to protect people, but also provide certainty and hold infringers to account, but at the same time, reward those companies that do their best to protect, respect, and defend consumers' privacy and then personal data. And this may seem obvious, a simple point, but if we think about what it took to get a successful general data protection regulation in the European Union, or even the most recent representative actions directive that allows for collective redress, also with regards to GDPR violations. And then, the list go on with other similar laws around the world that may have experienced that difficulty. We realize it's important not to take a good legal framework for granted, because this is the key for what happens in redress and enforcement and compliance overall. So the second ingredient really is effective and swift redress, and the GDPR here from a European perspective provides several mechanisms for that. And consumer organizations are in a unique position to act on the interest and on behalf of consumers. And this becomes even more crucial because individual consumers sometimes would be reluctant to just go to their data protection authority or even go to court individually, right? It takes some efforts, patience and money to do that. So we as BEUC and our member organizations try their best, and particularly with regards to certain actors. So for example, in 2018, several of our members issued a BEUC coordinated complaints to their national data protection authorities to complain about Google location data tracking practices. However, we're still waiting. More than 2 years later, we're still waiting to see a proper outcome of those, actions. In 2019, our member in France, UFC Choisir, also launched a collective action against Google for violations related to the processing of location data of their users. And there are many more examples. Just last year, just on time for the last CPDP, our Norwegian member, the Norwegian Consumer Council and NOIP filed complaints against Grindr and 5 ad tech companies. Then other consumer groups, and including also BEUC as well, notified respective national data protection authorities. We also go to the EDPS and informed, appropriate authorities and basically the world about systemic breaches of the GDPR in the AgTech sector. Other NGOs also joined from the other side of the Atlantic, so that shows that it's important to also seek collaboration, not only from data protection authorities, but also with regards to NGOs. And this is important because just yesterday, you probably have seen in the news that there has been an intention to impose a fine of close to 10 million euros against Grindr. And we're particularly happy just because it took just 1 year for this first step to take place. And this is based on the work, groundbreaking work, led by our member, the Norwegian Consumer Council. And the Data Protection Authority found several GDPR violations, in particular that Grindr disclosed personal data to third parties without valid consent. And also Grindr disclosed a special category of personal data to third-party advertisers without a valid exception from the prohibition that exists in the GDPR. And what is more interesting, I would say, is the reasoning of the Data Protection Authority. It's a fantastic read, really. And among other things, what it's interesting for us is that Data Protection Authority investigated these activities at the time of the complaints. We see sometimes that when we or our members or other NGOs issue complaints, then some data protection authorities only take into account what happens at the time of of their decision. And what we see as a problem is that the moving target, as we call it, right, that the law has been infringed for a while. We table a complaint, and then the company decides to act just only then to modify certain things, but not everything that needs to be fixed. And then, at the end of the day, the infringements that have existed and the lack of redress that has existed is not properly addressed. But here, it seems that it will not be the case, but of course, it's still early stages. Another interesting thing is that the DPA made clear that consent is the legal basis for processing personal data for the purposes of behavioral advertising. And opt-out cannot be considered consent. And linked to the presentation before, data controllers must be accountable also for the sharing of personal data from consumers to third parties. And this is particularly important. Why? Because, basically the whole point of the action was that the AgTech ecosystem was out of control. Even if consumers wanted to really take control of it, we saw that that was not possible, and Grindr was not taking responsibility or control in that sense. But of course, the norm goes way beyond. And then this brings me to the third point and final point I want to make today as my preliminary remarks, which is enforcement, right? To have good enforcement. Rules are as good as their enforcement. And a successful compliance story also comes about optimizing public, but also private enforcement. So for that, we don't only need successful decisions, we need independent data protection authorities. Fines make headlines, but are not the only enforcement tool. We also see sometimes that some DPAs focus on reprimands or threats without actual remedies. And we think that data protection authorities should all use all the powers and remedy necessary and available under the law, including interim and urgent measures. Just for example, like the Italian Data Protection Authority has announced against TikTok recently. And DPAs can even be creative, like the EDPS has been with building open enforcement tools like the website evidence collector. And here, I don't want to say that data protection authorities are the only actor that we should rely on. Governments also play a crucial role in ensuring enough resources and capacity for authorities. Controllers and processors also play an important role. I mean, if in the first place they complied with the law, both in the letter and in the spirit, we would not necessarily be needing to go in the next steps. And then finally, at the end of the day, we cannot put all the burden on consumer organizations or NGOs to bring cases or to enforce the law. I'm sure that some authorities benefit and actually always welcome, our constructive feedback, but we also expect authorities to take their role as well. And finally, for real, I just wanted to say that another thing that we found to be very good is to break the silos. It's important to build cooperation also from a geographical perspective. So it is good that the Global Privacy Assembly exists. Just last year, we became an observer, and we're very happy to contribute more. We're also very happy that there are initiatives like the Digital Clearing House here to connect different legal disciplines. For example, the Clearing House that connects different authorities working on data protection, consumer law, and competition. But we think that this can even be extended to other areas. And more importantly, we need more systematic cooperation because between authorities, because we see, for example, with the recent Google and Fitbit merger, that the cooperation between the European Commission in charge of competition and data protection authorities has not worked to the best potential that it could be achieved. And so clearly we there's room for improvement, there's good things. But I think if we have these three ingredients together, good laws, redress and enforcement, we'll be better off. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the nice words about the clearinghouse, which was the idea of the European Data Protection Supervisor, but which we also think that it needs right now the second kick off, I may say. We have to make the new life in it once again. But your discussion about the cooperation between the authorities, both between different kinds of authorities and different authorities in the different regions of the world, which actually brings me to the question to our Colombian friend on the cooperation that he mentioned during his presentation, the Ibero-American one, saying that Colombia plays an important role. It is. I have to say that it's one of the most, if not the most active data protection authority from the region. But at the same time, when we know how many problems we have with the cooperation when the law is the same all over Europe, or should be the same, how does it look like in Latin America? How does the the impact on the big players, on the big companies, on the big cloud providers look like in the Latin American region? Do you do it nation by nation, or you do it somehow coordinated way, or you try to coordinate with the other data protection authorities around the world?
Thank you. We do try to coordinate with the others. We try to gain some traction by assessing our investigation, trying to implement our own guidelines, and trying to influence the other authorities. We have different landscape regulations. We have countries who have laws, but they don't have the authorities, and other ones that have authorities more that emphasize more in privacy than data protection per se. I do think that Latin America has wasted a lot of time in this discussion about how independent their authorities are. And this is a discussion that sometimes gets politics in the middle about what the budget they might have, so they can be as independent as they want, but if they don't have the budget or the proper enforcement, as we were talking recently, it's a shame because you won't be able to do nothing. I do think that the success of the Colombian authority also has to do with the fact that we are the competition and the consumer protection agency. So we have a more holistic approach on the problem. We have much more powers. And I do think we are the most active in the region without saying that we're the biggest one. But we try to coordinate with the US some things, but we also reflect very much in what's happening in Europe and in the region. We're trying to influence in a cooperation that also reflects in our Andean colleagues, which they have big authorities like this one, but to try to go one by one. Unfortunately, besides the network, the Ibero-American network, and our participation in the commissioners' reunion, we don't have any other coordination organizations as for now. But I do think it's a challenge we will try to push forward in the Colombian presidency of the.
Thank you very much. And on the other hand, sometimes the problem is the coordination inside the country. And I think Canada is a very good example of the country which has a very complicated situation in this way, having the privacy commissioner on the national level, but having also the commissioners on provincial level. And when we think about the impact on the players on the cloud market, that requires the cooperation of those who are supervising the public authorities and those who are supervising the market. How does it work in the country which is the federal one?
I think what I can say there too is that at the provincial level, there are authorities which jointly supervise the public sector and the private sector. And then at the federal level, there are entities like ourselves which also jointly supervise public and it does require a lot of integration. So communication with those entities between the federal and the provincial. So I think we're careful to understand where our jurisdiction ends and where it starts, so that we're making sure that the right law is applied. Fortunately, there is a fair amount of coherence in kinds of obligations that different institutions have at the different levels. And really what we have found in our collaborative work, both domestically and internationally, is even when statutes are written differently, you can often find a lot of common ground, a lot of common core principles. For instance, I've talked about the idea of controllers and processors. That's not necessarily terminology that's used in our act, but it's inherent in the elements of our act. So there's always a way to find coherence. It has been our experience.
Great, thank you very much. We have to remember about the questions from the audience, which are coming one after another in the background, and we have to leave the time for that. But let me also ask Paul. Paul, what are your experiences in the negotiating with these hyperscalers? And do you believe that the other organizations, such as governments of the states or the education institutions or healthcare organizations, can even join the same level of the negotiations as you do, not even mentioning the small business?
Yeah, thank you, Wojciech. Now, of course, the interesting thing is that the services that are offered in the digital domain, services from the hyperscalers that we've mentioned, they come into the market and they are contracting with parties such as schools and hospitals and also, as I mentioned, that are not in a position to invest the money that the central government is able to do on behalf of itself. And what you see is that it's a take it or leave it model. So for instance, if you look at Google and you look at the digital classroom, or you look at Teams and you look at the digital classroom that schools are using, they don't have the same improved contracts that we have at central government. And that means that the data that is collected during classes or all these things are actually going to the United States and are used to build these profiles, as we have proven, and as the Dutch AP and the research of the Canadian colleagues has proven in the past on Windows 10. And I always say, Wojciech, to keep it short, that I find it amazing that you can buy a car from Japan and it will have some sort of check at the border before it enters the European market, that it has the right safety provisions, etc. I mean, when I buy a car, I don't do a crash dummy test and then buy a next car because it proved out to be okay. But when in the digital domain, everybody can just enter the market without this seal of approval, this German TÜV sticker or whatever you want to call it, or a Euro seal saying this digital service is suitable for use in healthcare, in government, in schooling, etc. And I would really plead that we would stop asking the controllers, which are these smaller institutions at large, to do this all individually and waste all these public funds, but have some form of European check at the gate where they get a stamp like a car or like a vaccine, and then we know, oh, it has the stamp, we can use it without further concern. And that will be a great improvement, I think, for many of the controller organizations in Europe.
Thank you very much. I said at the beginning that BEUC the talking with BEUC is a challenge for the data protection authorities, but that's because you are saying about what's going on the ground, and you are asking from the position of somebody who has made a lot of actions all over Europe, or even all over the world. So what I would like to ask is, what are the main advices? What are the main points that you want to show to the data protection authorities in order to be more efficient in the enforcement and the compliance?
Thank you. I mean, first of all, yeah, I think my first advice, or our first advice, would be, take what you have and go and enforce it as swiftly as possible, with the means that you have. I mean, there's oftentimes discussions about limitation of resources of data protection authorities, and there I echo what has been said before, that it's up to member states to not only make sure that data protection authorities are independent, but also that they have the resources at hand. As said before, if authorities can take all the means available to them to enforce the law, they should, and they should not be scared to take very effective remedies, such as stop the processing of data that has been done illegally, at least as an interim or urgent measure. That would be very good and better. We have made a set of recommendations on top of these ones, like, for example, at the European level, we have the European Data Protection Board, and there we have suggested, for example, to have a mechanism to harmonize a bit how to handle cross-border complaints, because we see a lot of delays and a concentration in some, some bottlenecks, let's call them like that, in certain countries. And so we would like to deblock them and help data protection authorities. Our goal is to work together with data protection authorities and help them to enforce the law and get consumers redress. So we're always available to interact with data protection authorities. We try our best. Also, our resources are very limited. I can tell you that it's very costly. And also, it's very difficult when you need to engage, particularly on a procedural law that is not your own, and definitely in a language that is not your own as well. And so when you also need to coordinate actions between different members in different countries, this even becomes more complicated. So we sympathize, but we need to go forward with swift enforcement using the tools available, ensuring that we have enough resources.
Thank you very much. I move to the questions which we got from the audience. I will be presenting the persons who asked the questions exactly as they were in the chat. So we have the question from oh yeah, I know. Okay. We have the information that Simon Hania is in the room and can address the question directly. So, Simon, if you can.
Yeah, I should be able to.
That would be better.
Yeah, thank you. Now, this is an experiment whether the audience can participate, I would say. So thanks. The question I have, and as a bit of background, I am a data protection officer, so I very much recognize the topics you're raising, because I have to deal with them myself when dealing with, well, SaaS companies, let's call them like that. But the question I would have is actually that the privacy regulators and the purchasers are now teaching, in a way, where the bar of GDPR and other regulations across the world lie to big IT companies. Now, ironically, that makes them a better company to compete with smaller companies that don't have the resources to know where the bar is and be able to jump that bar. So how should we make sure that this does not have in itself what I would call a regulatory network effect of contracting to even more large-scale ICT companies, where the smaller ones in the Netherlands, in Colombia, wherever, will not be able to do so because they simply can't reach that bar. And I'm particularly asking Paul, have you thought about that when you now have a very high bar, which is the right bar, I think, how to deal with the smaller local companies that also want to make money in serving the public sector? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Simon, for your question. It's a very good question. First of all, the height of the bar. We have laid the bar at compliance to the GDPR or local regulations and nothing else, and nothing more than that. So frankly, everybody should jump over that hurdle, if you will, to be able to sell services, in my case, in the Dutch market. At the same time, I do understand that it is difficult for smaller companies because they might not have had the conversation with the procurement agents doing this. So therefore, again, I believe a certification scheme for SaaS products, which in my view should be at the European level, would be the way to do it. That you have a SaaS service, you offer it up to it's the same like a TÜV proofing or a CE mark for electrical equipment. You would have a mark for SaaS services. I believe that is the route to fairness and a level playing field. Yes, it will cost a little money, but I do believe that that's the only way to do it, rather than all these custom solutions that we have at the moment failing such a scheme.
Thank you, Paul. We have a very good question from Daniela, and I don't know if it's possible for Daniela to ask it. If not, I will ask it myself. Okay. Okay, so then the very shortest and most the easiest question, I may say, which is if Paul's slides are available.
Yes.
Okay, so you definitely can find them both from the organizers and on the from the Dutch ministry and from EDPS as well. And then we move to another question. Yeah, is Daniela coming? Okay.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the presentations. I would be directing my question to Paul, because I really liked the idea of contracts and the relationship between the controller and processor. However, I would like to know how easy the negotiation with these big companies, more relating to communication providers, was to let them and make them set up and establish a relationship of controller and processor, and whether you faced a shift or a will to shift from controller processor to controller relationship. Because I also heard and faced moments when the big companies would be rather willing to say, "Oh, we are using the personal data for our own purposes as well, not only for the purposes you are willing to." That's why the shift to controller. But I'm happy if anybody else can also react. Thank you very much.
So very shortly, because we have to allow one more question.
I think other members have an opinion as well, but to answer the question quickly, one, how hard is it? It's extremely hard and extremely expensive. Think about more than €1 million to have negotiate one contract with one party, and that is every 2 or 3 years when they renew. Second question is, I'm not in favor of a controller relationship, because that still means that you're facilitating the leakage of data to these people that will monetize it through all the things that I mentioned earlier, and that is actually a topic for a whole different session. But I yield to my colleagues in the panel for their comments.
Any other comments from the panelists?
I'll say not specifically related to negotiating contracts, but we did find, and I recognize here that this is talking about central government playing a role, which we did in the Microsoft 10 investigation. But we did find that Microsoft was very willing to talk to us about where that bar was and what the standard was. And we have then been able to leverage that by publishing our report, which talks about the kinds of practices that are necessary, so that hopefully, ultimately, it doesn't take $1 million every 2 years to negotiate this, because there are standards, and if enough organizations start to have these negotiations, I think that's where you get the effect. And if those negotiations and the results of those negotiations get published, and then people can see what other people have gotten, I think that's when you start to change the ecosystem.
There was a question if the lack of this willingness to change the conditions for the smaller players is not the sign for the data protection authorities and for the consumer organizations to step in and start to enforce it, either by fines, as Dpa'S, or in the court cases or any other ways by the consumer organizations. Can we get your points of views on that in 2-3 minutes?
Sure, I can start if you want. So basically, the lack of compliance or the difficulty to comply by some companies, I mean, that's acknowledged. It's not, it might not be an easy task for everyone. However, I think Paul said it very clearly that the bar has been set by the GDPR. And so when public authorities, democratic institutions have taken the decision of what the bar should be, and then also how enforcement is going to be triggered, also in relation to size, and some obligations have been nuanced for small companies, I think the bar has been set correctly. With regards to whether consumer organizations can fill the gap to help them, I mean, we do our best to protect consumers. And I have shown already a few examples where we try to do that, and we're not alone in this task. However, we cannot rely always on data protection authorities, and especially not on NGOs, to do the job of actually controllers and processors and the enforcers. We're there to help, and we always will try our best to defend the interests of consumers. But I think everybody should play their role, and the burden should never be put on consumers, because I think that's the weakest linkage.
Any other comments? If not, we will have to go to the summary, because it's already almost the end of the time for us. So I would like to ask all the panelists to find the 140 signs answer. So just tweet of an answer of what can we do, data protection authorities and the other stakeholders, to make the enforcement of the rights to privacy and rights to data protection from the big players more effective.
I can jump in, and I think. Oh, sorry.
No, go on, Amanda.
Okay, and just say that I think concrete investigations go a long way, because then you come out with examples, you come out with techniques, you come out with, you take the rules of a regime like GDPR or our domestic regimes, and you give them life. And then not only that, you've changed not only that, say, one IT processor's approach, but then if you publish it and you push that message out, then you can change other processors' approaches, and you can provide models, meaningful models for smaller players who maybe don't have the time to try to understand it themselves, but if they see an example, then they can apply it in their own situation. So I'm a strong believer in sending a message through specific instances and looking at particular instances, and I think that's something the DPAs are well positioned to do.
Perfect, Andres.
Thank you. I do think that it's important to balance ex-ante measures and ex-post measures. I do think that, of course, to comply, it's important to have a swiftly approach and enforcement. But we have been proven to be very successful in providing guidelines to the industry, but building them hand in hand with the NGOs, the different stakeholders, and just not imposing them and trying to bring them in a sort of a guided path in order to comply. And this has also been very successful, to have the authority very proactive in what the regulatory changes are. For instance, what we have in consumer tourism, consumer protection is very important because of the use of apps and platforms that usually process their data in third countries. So the fact that we ask them to comply with our law will be a heavy burden on them, without having the perspective that in the end we have to protect the consumer, and here the law is very it has a burden of proof higher for the stakeholders or the companies in order to protect the consumer. But I do think the balance between guidelines and ex-ante regulatory measures that we can advise, and the ex-post, of course, the imposing of fines and a swiftly approach in order to enforce the law.
Thank you. A message from Vogue.
Our message is clear. We need to ensure that enforcement is swift and effective. And for that, we need to ensure that all actors play their role. And in particular, when it comes to data protection authorities, they should not be afraid of using the tools available, including in particular urgent interim measures, and even go as far as prohibiting illegal data processing that has been happening.
And the message for the DPAs from the governments, but first of all from those who said no pasarán, or we check.
Well, I think I'll keep it very short, and I'll just repeat what I said earlier, and it links into what Marianne said about the fact that we notice in the field that the DPAs are sometimes resource constrained. So I think the bundling of those resources in a more centralized entity that will act for the whole of Europe would be a big improvement in the times it takes to do investigations and come to rulings, etc. And I believe, and this is the third time I mention it today, so maybe somebody has taken a note. I think a Euro seal for entry to the market for cloud SaaS providers would be a very, very good thing to have. But ANISA is working on some things relating to cybersecurity, but that's only part of the scope. I think we should have an overall Euro seal stamp of approval, and without it, you can't sell your stuff on the European market. That would be my procurement advice. Obviously, it's not the opinion of the Dutch government, but it's the opinion of the strategic vendor manager and the stakeholders behind it.
Thank you, Paul. Though I have to say that I will have some doubts about the seal like that from my point of view, because of the seal for the car is not the seal for the software because of the dynamic environment. But this is to the next discussion that we should have. I think that this discussion has shown that the concerns are really big. The concerns about the role of the big players, role of the big producers of the ICT environment, not only the software, but environment that the public administration and the individual persons and the companies are working in, both because of the processing of the personal data by service providers for their own purposes, for the lack of control over the sub-processors, data allocation, data transfers, risk of unlawful disclosure of the data, and there is definitely a scope for improvement in the development of contracts. And this is why more than a year and a half ago, together with the Ministry of Justice and Security of the Netherlands, we have created the Hague Forum for cloud contracting, public administration representatives, and for the international organizations that have the very similar problems. And I believe that this panel has also confirmed that we need regulatory cooperation and active participation of the other stakeholders, the companies, the public administration, the competent authorities in the data protection, competition, consumer law, as well as the users, the data subjects. Once again, let me stress the sentence which was said by my predecessor, Giovanni Buttarelli, that we are not defending the data, we are not protecting the data, we are protecting the human beings, and that's something which we have to remember about. Because at the end of the day, this all comes to upholding the fundamental values in the digital world and simply respecting the rule of law. We need to minimize our reliance on any kind of monopolies, and the providers that are providing us monopolist approach, having fair and compliant terms and conditions. And this is not only for the sake of respecting the letter of law, the same level of the protection should be guaranteed for all individuals. And saying as European Data Protection Supervisor, who is supervising the public authorities, public administration in the European Union, I have to say that these individuals are not only those whose data are processed by the EU institutions, but also the people who work for the EU institutions. This is, after all, their personal data, which is sent to the cloud providers across the ocean or on the European ground, and the information about these persons is revealed. Thank you very much, all the participants, all the people in the auditorium. Thank you, CPDP organizers, for giving us this possibility. And I hope that you took a lot of information from this panel, and that you will be able to implement it in the future works on the contracts of the cloud. Thank you, all of you panelists, and see you at the next panels of this CPDP.
Thank you.
Thank you.